I don't think there's any research that actually says that it would acquire those words faster long term.
I guess like my point is more like the benefit of Anki is more. Hey guys, welcome back to the KoreKara podcast. Yeah, so this week on the podcast we talked to Justin Sung, who's a medical expert, and he makes videos about his thoughts on most efficient studying methods and has a lot of videos analyzing the ineffectiveness of Anki and the limits of active recall. So we get into a pretty interesting debate on the podcast where I argue that Anki is useful for language learning, but you guys can check it out.
You know what is effective though? Smashing the like button. So before we even get into that, you know what to do, guys.
Yeah, and as always, make sure to be following us on Twitter.
Let's go.
Yeah, Justin, thanks for coming on the podcast, but can you give us a quick background of who you are and where you're at today?
Cool. So yeah, my name is Justin Sung. I used to be a medical doctor, but now for the last 3 years I've been working in education full-time. So I'm a learning coach. I help people to learn more efficiently across a wide range of subjects and different professions. So yeah, and I've got a YouTube channel as well where I pretty much talk about that type of stuff.
Right. Yeah, and I came across your channel actually because like some of our listeners actually recommended us to check out this one video that you did where you talked about the limits of like active recall and spaced repetition, because our podcast is about language learning, and so a big part of how everybody learns languages from the people we talk to is using Anki and spaced repetition.
Yeah.
But like, what are your thoughts, if you could briefly like talk about Anki and spaced repetition?
I think one of the common things that people need to really wrap their heads around is that learning is not like a simple thing. It's not like there's a single solution that achieves a single, universal outcome. It's not like if you do spaced repetition through, like whatever app that you're using, it's not going to then just directly translate to mastery of a language, because mastery of a language is actually a really complex thing. You need to know vocabulary, but you also need to know grammar and syntax and logic, and you need to develop procedural fluency. You need to be able to recall it quickly. You need to be able to use that knowledge in different contexts and different types of environments. Right. And what something like Anki does with spaced repetition frameworks is that it is allowing you to build some level of retention of information through purely just through what's called preventing retrieval failure, which is that if you don't retrieve something often enough, your knowledge will decay. And knowledge will decay no matter what. And the idea is that if you just continue to space it, and there's a lot of research on the timing of the spacing and what works better and what doesn't. But if you just continue to space it and you continue to repeat it, it will deepen this neural groove that allows the information to be stored there. But the way that it stores the information is, first of all, very isolated. And secondly, it's very like brute force. So there's a lot of things in life that we learn that we don't actually need to do that level of heavy spacing for, and we can still learn it very easily. Like, most people aren't doing Anki for the first language that they learn to speak. Unless you grew up in like some cave by like wolves and you like learned English as your first language when you were like 11, when you were discovered by civilization, like people are not learning languages that way. A lot of people are not learning, other things in their life like hobbies or anything else where they may actually develop a really deep level of, knowledge about it. Like some people, if you get someone's favorite movie or like a favorite book series, there are some people that will know like which chapter of which book a certain event happened in, and they can take two characters from two book series and they can create like an entire scenario of exactly how they would interact if those two characters met. That's like the level of depth that they have on their knowledge, and they're not going through reading a book and then making some Anki cards and then before bed like smashing through like 200 cards. Like the human brain does not need that heavy level of repetition to learn information. And so what the research shows is that Anki is good and spaced repetition is good for creating especially short-term retrieval, for isolated facts. But when we start looking at high volumes of flashcards, lots of stuff to learn over a long period of time, and then being able to actually use that information in a meaningful way, it really starts to fall apart. And we start seeing that really the main benefits are not coming from that. So for example, you could do like 1 million flashcards, but then afterwards, if you have a conversation with someone, you may still struggle. But if you were to have, let's say, 3 or 4 conversations, you may actually develop more mastery than the 1 million flashcards combined. So in that case, it's kind of like, well, what was the point of that first mode?
Yeah. I would say like an argument against that is that the point of using Anki for language acquisition is not to learn how to output the language through using Anki.
Yes.
Because the idea is like Anki is not going to be the only source of you learning this one word. It's more like a way to artificially see the word more times so that in your immersion, when the word comes out, you don't have to go look it up in a dictionary, which is the same thing as spaced repetition, because it's like the natural frequency of the word, and every time you look it up to remember what that word means is same as spaced repetition, right?
Yeah.
So would you say like in that instance, Anki is useful?
It's yes and no, because you're bringing up a really good point, is like that Anki is a very specific purpose. And so I agree that it can be a really good supplement to something else, but it's kind of like if you don't have the other thing, and if that other thing is not tuned in more, you're not really going to get that much benefit from Anki. And we know this, you know, we have like I work with so many language learners that have been trying to on and off to learn a language for like 5-6 years, and they have like more cards than they even know what to do with. And every time they take a break, they just start the cards from scratch because they never got to finish their deck. And they eventually get to a point where they've got so many things on repeat that they just give up on even doing all of them that's you, and they just sort of start again. So we know that it does achieve that like very specific type of retrieval in terms of getting some words into your vocabulary and getting them in enough frequency. But the thing is that it's not necessary to do it in that way, right? So what you were saying is that if you were having like a natural conversation with someone, there are words that are coming up. If you were to look up that word, that is not actually the same as if you were to see that word appear in flashcards through Anki, because the context of how that information is presented to you is different. So for example, like a really, really clear example would be like your phone number. Now, let's just say for your example, right, that your phone number is like 123 4567 89. Okay. Now, a lot of people, if you said that to them in like, so is your phone number 1234 567 89? They'll be like, visualize it, try to see if that matches the way that they understand it. And then once they have it in their pattern of like 123 456 789, then they would be able to make that connection. Because the structure and the context and how the information is perceived makes a really big difference to how understandable and how easy it is to actually retain. So a word that comes up in just normal conversation, and you looking that up in the context of using that word immediately for the purposes of that conversation, allows you to retain that word much better than just purely doing it beforehand. So what I usually say is you should do it in reverse. You should be starting with conversations and doing lots of what's called interleaving, which is one of the most evidence-based ways of actually acquiring new skills, including languages, which means looking at the information, but from multiple different angles. Or, for example, having conversations. Like, for example, really common way people will learn languages is they'll start with a very simple dialogue. Going to the store, asking where the toilet is, how are you, how was your day, how was the weather, things like that. And then there's sort of scripted responses underneath that. But a more effective way of doing that is don't just have the, how was your day? Have, 3 other variations of asking kind of the same thing. And then for each of those variations, think about 2 or 3 different ways that people may actually respond to that question, and create these branching chains of dialogue that are still relatively simple, but sort of hit the information in different ways. And you can learn how the word fits in different syntaxes, how you can manipulate it, where it works and where it doesn't, how it needs to be modified when you use it with, other types of words. And we get that deep understanding of it straight off the bat. And then once we've done that, we can see, hey, there are a few words here that for some reason I just can't keep getting. I've done this interleaving, and I've done the dialogue, and all these words, I sort of figure out how they work, and I'm confident enough to use them. I can go over to my friend's house and I can, talk to their parents in this language, and, I'll be able to hold a conversation. But these few words here just don't seem to be sticking in. That's the stuff that you should be putting onto Anki. Right? Because that's stuff that has been shown that through a more efficient way of encoding the information, it doesn't seem to have stuck for whatever reason. And that could be really, really complicated. But for whatever reason, it hasn't seemed to work. So we can then just say, okay, let's try to brute force this in. And then, 3 weeks later, it might click and be like, oh, I'm starting to get it now. We can take it out of the Anki deck.
Right. Yeah, I think that's actually like a mistake a lot of people do with Anki, which is like they try to learn through Anki. Like Anki is the method that they use to learn, but actually I think it's more effective to use Anki to, like you said, just remember to recall the things that you have trouble like recalling, or things that maybe come up less often in the natural frequency of conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I would actually suggest that if there are words that are not coming up high enough in normal conversation, that's something that rather than putting that into Anki to begin with, we should be thinking about ways of interleaving our dialogue to give ourselves opportunities to have that come up more frequently. So I don't know if you've ever talked to anyone about or like learn about the idea of like comprehensible input and comprehensible output hypothesis. Yeah. Like those are, two very predominant kind of themes in learning, and the combination of like comprehensible input plus output and this idea of what's called pushed output, which is essentially, I don't know if, again, you've heard of pushed output, but it's just the idea that instead of just getting someone to say something, you actually push them to output it in ways that they are uncomfortable with, and it makes them find gaps, and it increases these things called like learning events, where it basically means that they are gaining ground in their learning. So if you think about comprehensible input, comprehensible output, and then having actually the push in retrieval, very few of those things are ticked when you start with Anki and you finish with Anki, and there's not a whole lot going on. Most people will just add on like practice and dialogue and speaking, just kind of sprinkled over the top of it. But it really should be completely flipped the other way around. Like people that have 300-400 cards in their Anki flashcard base, they should really be cutting that down to like 50, 60, beyond 100, really. If they're all 100 new, like no one who can do that, who can learn 100 new words through just pure repetition and actually hold on to that. Like after a month, if you don't practice it like every single day, you just like you're slipping on that vocabulary just like by the second.
Yeah, personally, I found the best results just 10 words a day, and
even 10. Honestly, 10 is like, you got to put in some serious time, like, because even with a 10, right, like you're probably also supplementing that with other forms of practice. If you're just doing the 10 and you're not at least consolidating that on like every few days or once a week or something, like actually trying to use it, then it can. That's
well, like it depends if you're talking about just like basic fluency or getting to like actually higher levels, because there are words that you see very often that everyone knows, like shows up in writing a lot, that is never used, and if you use it in conversation or even through messaging, it's not a natural statement, right? So those you kind of have to artificially like increase the frequency at which you see it, unless
are we talking about like pretty specialized words, or like what type of words are we talking about here? Like business,
like literary words, like words that show up in novels a lot, that pretty much is like really awkward if you say in real life, like descriptive words, stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's like unless you actually cram a lot of reading into a short amount of time, it's like a way for you to artificially hack and acquire those words slightly faster.
I don't think there's any research that actually says that it would acquire those words faster at long term. I don't think there's any research that's ever actually shown that if you take words that you're not then applying and consolidating through some form of actual interleaving, that just doing the flashcards on it produces meaningful long-term results where you're actually able to apply it. There's some research that shows that you can at least just do individual recall of it, but in the absence of actual interleaved retrieval, I'm not aware of anything that actually says that it's meaningfully useful.
I guess one distinction that's important to make is that the typical flashcard that people we interview on our podcast make is called like sentence cards. Mm-hmm. So basically it would be a sentence taken directly out of context, like from a novel, for example, where there's only one word you don't know. So this goes in line with the comprehensible input, where there's only I+1, like one single unit of word that you don't know, and you understand it in context. So in terms of how, like what the card is, it's only a recognition card where you see the word and then you recall what it means, and then you try to understand what the sentence means.
Yeah.
So like this is a word that you will pretty much never need to use in conversation or in output, but you will need to know if you want to be able to read like a newspaper, for example.
Yeah, sure. So if that word is then viewed out of context, so let's just like say that this didn't exist, like we didn't do this in the first place, and then we were just going in our daily life, and then we just encountered this word in the newspaper, for example, and we saw this word and we thought, hey, I don't know what this word means. right? What would be the difference between at the time of seeing the word in use, which is infrequent, seeing the word in use, not knowing what it means, looking it up, and then learning it at that time, versus proactively in advance cramming through more unfamiliar words with the hopes that you would actually be able to then retain it and remember it for when you see it in these infrequent cases,
right?
Wherever you're sort of, getting it. Like, what's the difference there, really?
I would say like let's hypothetically say like there's a word that only shows up maybe 5 times a year, but every native speaker knows this word. So maybe 5 times a year is not enough times for you to actually remember how the word is pronounced and what it roughly means, right? Because if you want to know the actual meaning, like the true nuance, you have to see in many different contexts. But let's just say you want to know a rough meaning and how to pronounce it, and 5 times a year is not enough. But if you put it into Anki, you would be seeing this word like every other week, for example. So you would see it like 30 times in a year. So that just ensures that the times that you actually see it in the wild, in the newspaper, you'd be able to recall it.
So we're talking about people that have actually already like a pretty good level of mastery, and now they're just looking for those words that are, very, very, very rare, very, very specific, a very small list of words and nuanced context that they're just trying to understand.
I guess I wouldn't say it's like very like specific and rare words, but more like it's definitely beyond normal fluency, like beyond like daily vocabulary. Like people who are trying to like read novels in a foreign language, for example, or just be like functional, like working in a different country, for example. Like there are those words that you would have to acquire in terms of like understanding what they mean.
So there's an approach that I teach to people that because a lot of my students are on like work visas and stuff in foreign countries, and they're trying to get that like professional level fluency of this second language, and like a lot of people don't have time to just spend all of their time like learning the new language. They have other things to do, and also just like a life to live, right? So what I tell them to do is to go through their daily life and their work, and every time they come across a word that they don't know, have a little notebook or something next to them where they just write down what it is, and at the time they can just look it up, and then throughout an entire week just tally up the number of the number of times that each word comes up, so that by the end of the week we have like a frequency distributed count of all the different words that could be used and that have come up. And essentially what you're talking about is like something that comes up like 5 times a year. That's the level of frequency where at no point would you really make the priority to learn that, because there's always going to be other words that come up that are more frequent that you also don't know, that are more high yield to know. In which case, I think the argument there is that you should really be learning the words that are more common first to build up your basic fluency. That becomes a stepping stone to enter into more advanced conversations where potentially these more obscure words could come up more frequently. Like if your language limited because of other areas of fluency preventing you from engaging in, like a business negotiation where there could be very specific words being used, well then the reason that you're not encountering it more often per year is because you're only able to communicate within daily life. And then actually it would be like kind of the reverse, is that you are limited because of the fact that you don't have other levels of mastery. And therefore, and then at the end of the week, you just go through that list and you start with the highest frequency ones first. And then because of the fact that it's naturally interleaved and because we had the context in it, we can go through and do that dialogue option. We can interleave it. And at that point, even if it's still not sticking, we chuck it into our Anki and then we can continue to repeat it. But if we're at a point where like we've got all of that covered and the only words that we don't know now are like one word that you heard one time like 3 months ago, and you're like, man, I don't know what that word means. And
well,
that's
it could be like, let's say like elections roll around and then a bunch of election words. You would have to wait till the next time election rolls around that now you could finally like, but then you would have to look it up again, or like, oh, tax document words. But then if you just sort of like front loaded that and then periodically were like keeping contact with this word like almost artificially, the next time it comes up, you won't have like a full understanding of the word, but you'll sort of remember, oh, this means like the left party or something, for example.
But the frequent, like, because language, like words have an exponential level of like diminishing returns. Like the total number of words in a language is like, I don't know, like several, like 30,000 or so. It depends on language, obviously. But let's say it's like 30,000 to 50,000 different words in a language. Like 90% of daily speaking is going to be through like the most common 1,000 words or something, right? And then like 99.9% is going to be through like the following 1,000. So you're going to have like 10,000 words that, yes, it could come up every time that there is like a election year coming up. But to be able to say like proactively that here is like just a list of words that come up extremely infrequently that I will need to know for like a very specific context. I mean, I don't know how that is going to mathematically scale, and we're just spending hours and hours on doing these flashcards every single day.
My point is more like the benefit of Anki is more shown through there in those cases. Like, for example, like if you wanted to get into investing, for example, in a foreign language, you could read a book on investing, but you would have to look up every other word, like for the duration of the entire book almost, even though the same words are popping up, right? But if you just kind of front loaded that by maybe taking like the top 100 most common words in this field and then sort of just reviewing that, you would be able to go through the book much easier, right?
So you're saying that you would, before looking at the material, you would look up like a separate list of common words in the field and then front load it, do the spaced repetition on it until you get to a level of mastery where for those 100 words, you actually are able to retrieve it, which realistically 100 words, let's say, is going to take like weeks really to get a level of mastery where you've got retrieval on it. And then we go through the material and then we see it in context and then we can actually understand it at that time. I just think it's so much more efficient to do it the opposite way around. Start with the material. Yes, if you need to look up every second word, that's fine. But what's the difference between looking up every second word versus having a list of every second word that you're then just going to, go through repetition? At least flipping it gives you the opportunity to learn it in a way that is framed a little bit more naturally, where the context of the word itself allows you to hold on to it.
That's what I mean. Like you read through the book, right? And pretty much like maybe every word that you see for the second time, like if it shows up 2 times and you still can't remember what it means, then you add it to Anki, for example.
Yeah. So that's a lot more of an effective system. I normally say 3 actually. So I have this thing called flashcard rule of 3, where I say if you have something that comes up, wait for it to come up the 3rd time before you don't remember what it is. Right. And there's a lot of stuff about micro retrieval and micro spacing and stuff that goes into that. But in a single study session, let's say if it comes up 3 times, and then you can add it to your Anki deck. And then when you review it, if you're able to get it right for the first 3 tries in a row, remove it from it. And if you if you get it wrong 3 out of 5 attempts, so any 5 consecutive attempts, if you get it wrong 3 times in that 5, doing more repetition is probably not likely to massively increase the retention of that word, because there's some contextual element to it that is just, going off. So you would do a deeper dive, like for example, looking at the etymology or where that word is derived from, or something else that builds unnecessarily high level of connection with that word that would allow you to hold on it and retain it, so that you're not just having that word that has been in your database like constantly repeating for the last like 4 weeks, and you have just gotten it on like off and on and off and on and off and on, right, like repetitively.
And that also makes me curious, like because you worked with a lot of students directly, especially like maybe like medical students. So do you have any like horror stories of people using Anki or like misusing Anki?
Dude, I've got more horror. Like I have people that literally like, I mean, like no joke, I have people with like serious mental health problems, a lot of it due purely to the fact that they have no time for anything else in their life, because they're spending like 6-7 hours a day on Anki every day. They have like 3,000 flashcards that they're trying to get to, because what they've been told is that spaced repetition is the king of all learning, that if you do more spaced repetition, your success in life goes up. And they are so stuck to that, and they have no alternative way of studying. As soon as they take a day off, they have accumulated like 500 due flashcards that they need to get through. And that's like the only way, for learning. Well, I have people that will be, like working as doctors or just professionals in general, people with busy lives that have other things going on. And let's say they're trying to pick up a language on the side, like A lot of the time it'll be if they have like a work colleague that speaks a certain language, or they work in a particular industry where they see a lot of clientele that's a specific ethnicity, or if their partners, a different, speaks a different language and they want to communicate with their family or things like that. And, this is probably the majority of language learners. Like the majority of language learners are people that are picking it up on this side, to
casually,
casually, right? And if you say to this casual learner that, you can get away with like 20 minutes a day until you learn your first 200 words, and then after that you need to spend 5 hours a day on Anki like every single day for like the next year and a half to get to that level where you can actually have like a 90% of the conversation, like no one's gonna commit to that, and they don't realize that going into it. And then so you have people like, I've got someone that's been trying to learn Spanish for like 10 years because they've just been like on and off, and they take a month break and they lose the whole language in that time.
Right.
So that I think if there's anyone that's listening that's making the decision, should I go flashcards? If you had to like min-max this, should I just go full immersion opportunities? Because you can get 20-30 minutes of immersion a day. Like you can give yourself opportunities to have 20-30 minutes of immersion versus having 20-30 minutes of Anki, or let's say even an hour. If you had to just pick, I would 100% say go with immersion and just push that till you feel like you are not getting any benefits from it at all. And purely going that route and then adding Anki supplementary later, kind of as a last resort, is going to yield faster results. It's going to allow you to consolidate. You're not going to get that big input of new information and that sort of structure and sort of sense of security that Anki provides. But if you actually look at your ability to navigate a conversation and your ability to engage in more learning opportunities, participate in dialogue, and therefore actually practice what you're learning and hold on to it long term in a way that doesn't feel like tedious as hell, then Anki is not the way to do that.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned that horror story. It's almost like a day job at that point. You just get up, you start doing Anki, and then you go to bed.
It is. I have some students that wake up at like 4 a.m., 5 a.m. to do Anki before school. Like that's their routine, is they wake up at 5 a.m. to smash out their 2 hours of Anki so that when they come home, they can do the remaining 4 hours.
Oh, man. It's a loaded schedule right there for sure. You hate to see it happen, but we definitely have interviewed people who have done that.
And it's actually, pretty sad as well, because it's not just for language learning, it's for everything as well. Like you could be learning science, or you could be learning like maths or whatever, and a lot of people will see like a new terminology, and the first instinct is like, all right, chuck it onto Anki, just let's memorize this new piece of terminology. But it's like, dude, if you actually just finish studying the whole chapter, there's no possible way by the end of this chapter you're not going to remember what that term means. Like all of the time spent on doing the Anki and putting in your notes and all the other stuff that you think you need to do to remember it, that's probably not even going to be necessary, because a week from now, you're not even going to be able to imagine not knowing what that word is.
Right.
And like having rote memorization as a last resort, I just think will help a lot of people with their mental health at the very least.
Right.
I think there is slightly a distinction as well, though, because like I'm sure for like science and like maybe math, it's more like theoretical concepts that you have to really understand and not really like rote memorization. But a lot of times in language learning, it's something like literally just how do you pronounce this like kanji. So it's a one-to-one like recollection. It's like either you remember it or you don't. And in that case, like it might make sense. Or even like people who use like Anki to memorize like the locations of all the prefectures in Japan or all the states, right? That's like something that
I mean, hands down, I'd say that when it comes to like all the different ways that you can use Anki, language is probably top of the list in terms of it being like useful and effective in like more situations. I don't think there's any other situation, unless you're just like literally memorizing a list of random facts to go in the chase or something. Like I don't think there's any other situation where it's as effective as it is for languages. But I think even in languages, it gets abused quite a lot, and people are not prioritizing the immersion or the comprehensible output aspect of it, and really pushing themselves with their interleaving.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess
and
with that,
Anki means rote memorization in Japanese, and it was created for the guy to study Japanese.
I don't know that actually.
You learn something new every day. But with that, Justin, I feel like you've taught everyone a lot. We've gone in so deep into the subject, but it's that time of every podcast where we get into the message to the KoreKara squad. And I know you've been raring to go and do this. You've done so much medical study. You're a doctor. And I know you've been studying for this moment to go and say the KoreKara message. So I'm going to put you on the spot right here to go and impart this piece of wisdom to the KoreKara squad?
My message would just be, just don't put too much pressure on yourself. That's my message, is that, you just chill out a little bit.
Right. You love to hear it.
Hey guys, thanks for making the end of the podcast. Comment down below if Justin convinced you to stop using Anki.
But you know what time it is? It's time to go and shout out the patrons with
Cedric, Rory, Faraz, Kevin, Alan, Drew, Jack, Jeanette, Joey, Cage, 90 Meredith, MKSXN, Nathan, Polars, Yuri, Sad Boy, Ripper, Japan, Quaid.